We are in 2 Peter. We are in 2 Peter chapter 2. We are in 2 Peter chapter 2, and we are entering into the third of three historical judgments to help make the point of God's judgment as well as his redemption. And as I don't know whether I say I pay attention to, but as I come across what ends up being political statements, national statements, whether you agree with them politically or not, you at least look at the motivation of the heart and try to look at whether that which is coming out of their mouths would glorify God if he was standing there, amidst them, or whether it's a slam in his face. And we live in a world in which God is either recognized and worshipped, or he is sidelined, maligned, ignored, forgotten, or absolutely rejected. So somewhere in there we have to find where we are and stand firmly in that. So when we come to something like 2 Peter chapter 2 and the historical things that Peter is presenting, using for the benefit of illustrating these truths so that even a child can pick them up and comprehend them after looking at them, we feel that we can live in our world with a recognition that it all matters. That God knows what's going on, and he's not ignoring it. It may look like he's ignoring it, but as we saw in verses 1, 2, and 3, which were preparatory for, like I said, propelling us into verses 6 through 10, we found that false teachers will come along, and the geography of that was God's church, which is among the most frightening things I could say from the safety of this pulpit. But then some of the safest places in the world, which includes a woman's womb, have been perverted and changed and chased. And so the pulpit has become, instead of a safe place, it's become a place of little demigods rising up and making statements. Look at me. Look at how smart I am, or how good I can make you feel. So verses 1, 2, and 3 talked about the false teachers. They would malign even the master who paid the price, who paid the penalty, who paid everything for the redemption of man. And yet these guys in verse 3, through their own greed, their own covetousness, will exploit the sheep with false words. And then it concludes there, as then we jump into verses 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, concluding with 9 and 10, that their judgment from long ago isn't just spinning its wheels, and their destruction isn't forgotten. It's not asleep. To illustrate that, Peter gave us 3 examples, and today we're on the third. And there's a progression here, and I'm going to try to explain that. First of all, the protasis, which I explained, is the if part of an argument, whereas the apodosis is the conclusion of the argument. If it rains today, the protasis, we will play ball. Oh wait, no, we won't play ball. Okay, well, you get the idea. Okay, so the protasis here, verses 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, is pretty long. And with that, you have an if. And you'll notice that, well, actually, I say you'll notice, in verse 4, for if God, and that's the beginning of the protasis, and that follows all the way through, even though you do not see it, That's the beginning of each part of the protasis. So for if God in verse 4, dealing with angels. Verse 5, for if God in verse 5 did not spare the ancient world. And then in verse 6, for if God condemned to ashes in verse 6. But if you let your eyes drift down to verse 7, most of the translations have another if. And that if in the New American Standard would be in italics because it's not in there, but then it's also not in there. It's understood to be in verses 5 and 6. So it's not that it's wrong, it's just that I don't think it belongs there, because I think verses 6 and 7 will be a unit. I'll explain that. In verse 6, just as we had the topic of angels in verse 4 and the ancient world in verse 5, so in verse 6 we have cities. So you see here that it's getting closer to home. First of all, the angels in time immemorable. We don't know when it happened. Angels, way up there, way out there, at some point in time. The next, he encompasses a whole world, the ancient world, and everything that happened there. Then in verse 6, he brings it down to 2 cities, which are named as Sodom and Gomorrah. That's how we understand them. There was actually 5 cities out in that valley. 4 of them were destroyed because at the end of the story, Zoar, Z-O-A-R, was saved because that's where Lot ran into, or that's where they said, okay, just get out of here, get into there. So 4 of the cities died. We really only remember Sodom and Gomorrah. In verse 4, there was the angels were not spared, but in verse 5, the ancient world was not spared, but in verses 6 and 7, we have the cities were destroyed, and then in verse 7 we have an and. There is no but. So already there's something different going on here, and I'll try to explain why that's important. In verse 4, the angels were not spared, but they were set up for judgment. They were cast into Tartarus, into hell, in preparation for, unto judgment. And it was an abandonment. And that will play an important part as an abandonment over here and a rescue over here that we'll get to in verse 7. But the abandonment into the casting into Tartarus and abandon unto judgment was looking toward the end. In verse 5, there was a cataclysm of the whole world, but there was a guarding of Noah, and that was the contrast. The contrast for the angels was there was no redemption. They were abandoned toward judgment. In verse 5, there was a contrast with there was judgment of the world, but there was a guarding of a righteous man, Noah. Now in verses 6 and 7, there is a condemnation. If God condemned, that would be the beginning of that particular sentence. And then we find what that condemnation was, and then we'll put those two together. There's 2 things that happened here. There was the condemnation, and then it was unto the destruction not by ashes, but it was all the way to turning them to ashes. In other words, there was nothing left. When Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, it wasn't like, you can even look at a burned out apartment or a burned out house or a burned out something. There will always be something structurally standing. Sodom and Gomorrah, there was nothing. Nothing standing, nothing left. Everything was reduced to ashes, consumed, absolutely destroyed. And this condemnation isn't the same judgment, the sentence that we saw in verse 4. The angels were sentenced. Here, the condemnation was, it's all done. So you're condemned, poof. Not quite poof, more like whoosh. Or Fill in the blank. Whichever words you like. Anyway. So pick something. If God reduced by turning them into ashes in the condemnation all the way to catastrophe or destruction or annihilation or ashes works. That's what he did. And then he says something in the second part of that verse where it says, having made them an example. Having made them is easy way to say it in English, but the concept there, and there's two aspects of it. First of all is the definition, and then there's the tense. The definition is to set with design in a certain position. So in other words, whenever you hear Sodom and Gomorrah, and you've heard that, I mean, almost anybody's heard of Sodom and Gomorrah. If you've heard of that, it is established. That's not the word, it's actually setting up in a position of direction. So establishment works in my mind, but it's actually setting up as an example. That's what God did in the condemnation of Sodom and Gomorrah. He set them up as an example, and the next word is difficult to translate into the English, so I'm going to say for any in the future. It's looking at what is coming down the road, of what is going to happen. It will serve in general as an example. And that would be then, the recipient of that phrase is the ungodly. So what do we have there? We have God destroyed in condemnation Sodom and Gomorrah, and has forever, and I said the tense was another part of that, set them up at that time, and it continues to serve all the way to this time as an example of what would happen in the future to ungodly people. Now, is that pretty clear? I mean, it's pretty clear. And so you have this established in your mind, and we could go back and look at Genesis chapter 18, verse 20, where God said he was coming down and he was going to deal with Sodom and Gomorrah because they were exceedingly wicked. And then we get into chapter 19, where the two, I believe they're angels, they're called men, but it's kind of like, yeah. The two angels go, and the theophany, the Lord, stands and talks with Abraham, and Abraham talks about, oh Lord, you're not going to, surely you're not going to destroy any righteous people in town with the wicked. You're not going to do that, are you? What? I'll tell you what if there's 50? Will you save everybody? Will you save it all? Will you not destroy it if there's 50 righteous people in town? And you know the story. God says, yeah, I'm good. There's 50 righteous in town. I won't destroy it. And then Abraham, it's a real interesting story. That's not my story. But he went from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20, and finally he says, please don't be angry with me. I'm gonna do this one more time. Just one more time. And then I'll be quiet. What about 10? Will you not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if there's 10 righteous people? And the Lord says, I won't destroy it if there's 10. So the story is interesting because that is the premise, that God is not going to destroy the town if there are 10 righteous. And so the two angels go into town. Lot has become a leader of this terrible place. A leader, not the leader. A leader in this terrible place. And he sees the guys, and the Oriental hospitality enters in. He says, hello, hey, come and stay at my place. No, we're going to stay out here. We're going to just sleep on the park benches. Oh no, don't do that. Come into my house. Well, we don't want to. And finally he prevailed upon them. So they go, they have dinner, and actually it's kind of, they're about ready to turn the lights out when it says the men from every quarter of the city, young and old. And this is the horror of sin. They say, hey, those two guests in your home, which are under your protection and hospitality, send them out because we want to know them. And if you know anything about the scriptures, the word know doesn't mean, hey, my name's Wayne, what's yours? I like chess, you like checkers. Okay, this is great. No, it was, they wanted to have sex with them. The men of the city wanted to have sex with the men in the house. And they weren't going to take no for an answer. And actually, if you think about it, it was a near-run thing. The guys inside opened the door, grabbed Lot, pulled him in, slammed the door, and then it says they struck the men with blindness. Now, I know me. And if I was standing here talking to you and all of a sudden, I couldn't see anymore, I think you would know about it. I think I would say, all right, I'm done with my sermon. Can somebody please call 911 or get me to? But these guys, struck with blindness, the intent of their heart was so focused. And by the way, the word blindness, I go back and forth whether it was literal blindness or whether it was figurative blindness. That is to say, I know the door was just there. Hey, can anybody find the door? Because it says they wearied themselves looking for the door. They wearied themselves looking for the door so they could get in, grab the men, and grab Lot, because they literally threatened him and they said, now it's going to be worse for you than it would be for them. And it's like, well, that sounds pleasant. They would have gone in if they could have and destroyed them. The angels struck them with blindness. And at that point, it was the teeter-totter effect, which they were already in the process, but they could have left, let's get coffee and then we'll go. But now it's like, get anybody in town that understands that God's going to judge the city. Get them, get out of here. Come on, get them, get them, get them. So he goes to the future son-in-laws and says, hey, God's going to destroy this place. Come on, let's get out of town. And, when you have an attitude anyway, they thought Lot was just making fun with them, having fun, jesting. So they didn't come. And the angels, then Lot comes back and it's like, hey, we got to get out of here. Just let's get out now. And in essence, they were dilly-dallying. They weren't going to leave. And it literally says that the men grabbed the hands of Lot and his wife and of the two daughters, and they leave. Can you imagine? The angels are standing there, we gotta go. Well, you know what? I got a PTA meeting next week and Pinewood Derby coming up and just started the wheels. I can't even imagine, but they were dilly-dallying. Well, they went out and they get out finally, and because it's dawn, it's dawning, and Lot says, you know what? Can we just go to Zor? See, it's just a little town. Why would you destroy that? Okay, come on. Let's just go over here. Just let us go over here. Okay, but hurry. The Lord's waiting for you to save you. So they get into Zor, and then all heaven breaks loose. Well, it is fire and brimstone, so I'm not sure how to say that. But fire and brimstone, it says come down. I read one commentator who I highly respect, and he said that basically the ground opened up and gases came up and the whole thing went poof. And I'm thinking, that's really not what it says, so it's a good thought. But it says fire and brimstone came down, everything was destroyed. And we find Peter gives us he condemned to reducing it to ashes. So you look at where Sodom was just yesterday, and there's nothing but smoke. Nothing but smoke. It's all ash. All of it ash. Everything is ash. Everything in the valley except for Zoar. And then we find that, it doesn't say the next day, but I'm sure it was the next day, Lot and his two daughters leave. Wait, where'd his wife go? They were warned, and she did this. and she became a pillar of salt. And she's a pillar of salt, or she died. However you want to go there, that's not, again, a part of my argument this morning. So I'm not going to go there. But just Lot and his 2 daughters, and then they flee Zoar and head to the mountains to live in a cave. It's like, wow, nothing about this picture is right. So we get back to 1 Peter, and now we're in verse 7, and I do not believe the if belongs there, because there's an and. So this immediately, verses 6 and 7 are set apart as different from verses 4 and 5. There was this, but there was this. There was this, but there was this. Here, there was this, and there is this. So immediately it's set up differently. I don't think there's an if there. I don't think an if belongs there, because I think there's 3 historical examples, not 4. So verse 4, 5, and 6, and then verse 7 belongs with verse 6, and it says, and, where'd we go? And God rescued. He rescued. Now, rescuing is the opposite of verse 4's abandonment or delivery. And who did he rescue? He rescued the righteous or righteous Lot. And you're going to, if you are like me, you've struggled with that word. How in the world was Lot righteous? And I've thought a lot about it, and I'm going to give you 2 reasons why Lot is righteous. Number 1, because God rescued him from Sodom and Gomorrah. And God was only going to rescue, he wasn't going to destroy it if there was 10 righteous. Well, theoretically, there was at least 1. The wife, she's dead. The 2 daughters, you can read for yourself what happens after that. That's not a part of my sermon this morning. But if you don't know, read chapter 19 of Genesis. So we have a righteous man because God considered him righteous. The second is based upon everything in here, he was righteous by comparison. And honestly, I struggled because I don't see any righteousness in Lot, but then I am not God. And I'm also not the inspired writer of the Scriptures. So I'm just going to go with the Scriptures. And I believe he was righteous by comparison in that he did not participate in the depravity of how far Sodom had gone. How far had they gone? According to Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9, it says, because he's talking in the context of Israel at that time in Isaiah, but he points back and says, and they're just like Sodom, who did not conceal their sin. The Sodomonians, either one, had all come out of the closet. All of them were come out of the closet, and they said, here we are, and this is what we do. And if you don't like it, well, too bad for you, because we're going to do it anyway. So in Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9, it says they did not conceal their sin. So we find then in verse 7 of 2 Peter chapter 2, and God rescued righteous Lot, who was, now you have oppressed. And I just don't see that word. I see what the word is translated as being made exhausted. It's a passive, so it's happening to him, and it's to exhaust by labor or suffering, to weary out. He was exhausted from the constant righteous soul, kind of like that the piano wire that's really tight, and you go ding, and I hope it doesn't snap. He was exhausted in his soul from that constant exposure. In fact, it says here, sore wearied or exhausted by the conduct, behavior. Now, we've seen that word all over 1 Peter. We haven't seen it, I don't believe we've seen it all yet in 2 Peter, but we're very familiar with it from 1 Peter. The conduct, the behavior, the manner of life. By the conduct of lawless ones in excess. The lawless ones is more than just, you pass the stop sign without stopping, or you go 66 instead of 65. No, it's not that kind of lawlessness. It's neither caring for law nor conscience. That's how far and wide this word is. So in verse 7, we have and, so it connects with the judgment. We're going to continue this story. We're going to include Lot, but we're not going to set him aside as a contrast. That's what's sad about this. It's not strong enough a contrast to have the word but in there. So to me, that's the first thing about sadness in this. And rescued, God rescued, so we have that, and that's the point. That's the highlight. That's the good part. That's the only good part about 7 and 8. Because everything else in 7 and 8, you go, huh? What? Wow? Bad? Yep. And rescued righteous Lot, exhausted by the behavior, the manner of life of the lawless ones, both in conscience as well as deeds, in excess. And we discovered that excess was all that entails regarding sexuality, regarding no holds barred. We saw that earlier in verses 1, 2, and 3 about the false teachers. And verse 8, some translations have it in parentheses. It shouldn't be in parentheses. It's a continuation of the thought of his exhaustion and his righteous soul and confrontation. So this is going to be interesting because it's by sight and by hearing. Now, what I found in that is that he didn't actually do it. It doesn't say by doing. But believe me, if your eyes are seeing something every day, and we could, I've experimented this with a class before. I stood before them and said 9 good things, and then I called them ugly. And they all went, huh? If you hear something long enough, hey, it's only wrong if you think it's wrong. Hey, just because the church says it's wrong doesn't mean it's wrong. And so on it goes. If you hear things long enough and see it long enough, it's going to affect this. It's going to affect this. It doesn't actually say he did it. But by the way, and I didn't tell you this, the name of the sermon really is In the Nick of Time. That's what it really is. Lot is in process. As they say, he's swirling. By sight and by hearing, the righteous one, that can only be Lot, dwelling among them. See, that's a hand tipper, dwelling among them. You need to ask yourself, why didn't he leave? Why did Lot, the righteous one, not leave when this and approaching this every day? It says day by day, dwelling among them from day to day by day, every day, 24/7, sight, hearing, it was all coming to him. This isn't bad. This is good. And the things I've heard are good, are terrifying. This is where we go now. This is the conclusion with regards to Lot. And it's going to surprise you because in the New American Standard, it has it in parentheses. I disagree with the parentheses. This just continues. It's continuing the thought. For by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds. Their is not in there. It's not their righteous or lawless deeds. Sorry, their evil deeds or lawless deeds. Let me read it to you. For by sight and by hearing, the righteous one, dwelling among them from day to day, kept torturing a righteous soul with lawless works. See, the torturing is a singular. So it cannot be theirs, which is plural. It cannot be their lawless works, their godless works. if it's singular and we're talking about the righteous soul, we're talking about Lot. Lot's lawless works. He was tortured. In essence, I could say he knew the right thing to do and he did not do it. He knew the right thing to do. And if I was going to go that far, I would say that is how he was righteous. He at least knew what was right. And by the beginning of verse 8, by seeing and hearing, not doing, at least not yet. That's why I think this judgment came when it did, because given another, who knows how long, month, week, day, Lot would have been among the vortex of this swirling mass of sin. So what do we have in verses 6, 7, and 8? We have, remember, angels, earth, and now 2 cities, which actually is 4 cities, and should have been 5, but Lot, in his whining and complaining, said, let us run to Zoar, because it's closer than the mountains. It's like, it actually says, there's danger in the mountains. It's like, they just threatened to kill you, dummy. But anyway, that's just me. So they run into Zoar. God destroyed to ashes. He condemned. The condemnation was there. It wasn't waiting like the angels are waiting in hell for the final judgment. God said, we're going to take care of this. We're going to wipe it out. And another thing about this is, remember when he did the whole world, we read that in Genesis 6, that the whole world was continually, their heart's desire was to do evil. This is local. This is one spot. That's why it says 2 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. And God condemned them. And it wasn't just a sentence, it was the carrying out of the sentence. That's the whole point. But God, I said but, and, see, I can't help but contrast, but it doesn't contrast. That's the thing. That's why there's a whole unit where you need to see that there was lawlessness and unrighteousness and sin in this whole thing, and yet amidst that, God rescued this guy. Now, a conclusion is a little bit difficult to say, because I can say things like, and open doors that I don't want to open and I won't open. That you can go ahead and do what you want as a Christian and it's still copacetic, 2 thumbs up, it's fine, God knows you, you're good. I can't go there. This whole picture here is written the way it is, with an and rather than a but. Because amidst that, God's grace is still there. But man, do you realize what a close run thing this was? And if you continue reading in Genesis 19, you're going to find none of this ended well. He was saved, that is to say, he can still walk and eat. But man, almost everything else about Lot's life is just bad. And by the way, once we're done with Genesis 19, we don't know what happened to him. We don't know where he went, what he did. We have a couple of things like this, but that's it. So it behooves us not to use Lot as an example on how to live. See, I can stand close to the flame. Yeah, it's hot. I can see my hand getting red. I can stand close to the flame. See, I'm not getting burned. And there's a variety of things to respond to that, but don't do it. It's not the whole test of our walk with God is not to see how close we can dance on the edge. The whole thing is to know where the edge is and how much God disdains that edge, and to stay away from it, and to encourage others not to go near it. Whew. wondered how far I'd get today. Verses 9 and 10, which we will not preach next week, because next week is Easter, is the conclusion of this. It's the wrapping up of verses of the three historical events. And it's actually very encouraging. It's the apodosis, and it's the conclusion, and it should be good. So anyway, in this you see that God delivers, God protects, God rescues, but God also abandons. And I'm going to leave it there. Father, you've been very kind to allow us to open your word today. It's not what I call the happiest of passages to preach, but Lord, sometimes we just need to be reminded. We need to be reminded that judgment is, well, you have an opinion on right and wrong, and your opinion is the only one that ultimately matters. So, Lord, let us go with what you think and what you believe rather than what we heard on the news or what someone said officially in the official magazine of this topic. None of those things matter, Lord. It's what you say. So, go before us. Remind us constantly that you're the reason for every season. And bless us this week too, this Palm Sunday as we move closer to the Resurrection Day. Go before us in Jesus' name.